Hi everyone, welcome to this Adverse Reactions Essential Oil Masterclass. I'm really glad you're here. This course is going to give you so much clarity and confidence on the subject of essential oil safety. I'm going to talk about commonly misused phrases, misunderstandings. When I first started studying this topic, to be honest, I didn't even understand what was going on because people would interchangeably use the same terms until I had read like 4 or 5 different textbooks, and then I realized, oh, that's what's going on. So we're going to go through some just important distinctions. Like, what's the difference between these different types of adverse reactions, just to give you incredible clarity and clear up misunderstanding. I hope this does two things for you. One, I really am a person who cares about worst case scenarios and minimums. I like knowing what is the worst thing that could happen in this situation, just so that if it were to happen, I'm not completely blindsided and in a state of total chaos and confusion. The other day, the person who was the special needs helper for my daughter with Down syndrome at Sunday school turned out to be the founder and president of the World Food Bank, one of the most significant agencies providing relief in Africa during food unstable, like food stability crises in that continent, which mattered a lot to me. My grandfather was the second in command of the Peace Corps for 20 years, and he was in charge of the continent of Africa. And so, as I was talking with him, we were laughing about kind of this morbid tendency we have to always think about, well, what's the worst that could happen? And so even though this course is maybe not as exhilarating and hopeful and inspiring as some of the other courses, I really appreciate that you've taken the time to apprentice yourself to this, because it's going to give you an idea of like, well, what's really reasonably the worst thing that could happen and prepare you for it. And two, it will give you confidence because Facebook is a platform that gives a voice to a lot of people who maybe you wouldn't invite them to give you counsel in a way that they're giving on Facebook. And a lot of them can really uh, cause a lot of fear and accusation around essential oil safety when it's just not warranted and there's just so much negative energy. So you will be able to really respond to any negativity or accusations because you will know, you'll have total clarity on all the possibilities and you'll be completely trained for them. So I hope that this gives you confidence and clarity. And with no further ado, let's jump right in. So Robert Tisserand has said, compared to other types of toxicity, adverse skin reactions are difficult to predict. Skin use, topical use of essential oils is just not ideal use, not only because you have such a small uptake of the chemical constituents, but also because it is very volatile and adverse skin reactions can and do happen. These are caused by at least one of the following. I would commit these to memory. The dose is important, the degree of absorption is important, and the degree of reaction between the oil and the immune system are all factors that can cause an adverse reaction to essential oils. Now, this is something that there's quite a bit of misinformation on the internet. People will say, some people don't believe that you can have an allergic reaction. And in fact, I talked to one of the top essential oil scientists at doTERRA because I said, hey, are you aware that this is up on like one of your random blog websites from forever ago? And she goes, oh no, we would never say that. That's not true. And I was like, no, 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 it's on your website. She was like, what? And I was like, I'm sending you the link. She's like, thank you so much. That's really bizarre. So in the doTERRA community and just in general, I think in the Young Living community, like in a couple different communities, there's a whole bunch of people who think that it's impossible to have an allergic reaction to essential oil. And that's actually a common misunderstanding because people say, well, well, they wouldn't say this, but what they're claiming is, even though they probably wouldn't know this technical language, is that people will say that the constituents of the essential oils are essentially too small to be recognized by the immune system because they would say that the human body can only have an allergic reaction to proteins. And of course, essential oils don't create proteins. But essential oil constituents can chemically bind to proteins in the skin, and what they form is something called a hapten peptide complex. So this is a combination molecule that is absolutely recognized by the immune system, and once it's recognized by the immune system, if it is tagged as foreign or dangerous, you can have an allergic reaction to that. More on that later. For now, you should know that allergic response is actually the most common skin reaction, and that the most common presentation is a delayed hypersensitivity reaction that manifests as a rash. Fragrance is actually the second most common cause of skin allergy, right after nickel. So it's actually very common for people to be allergic to fragrance um, allergens. Okay, sorry. I just am really glad that you're apprenticing yourself to this material and that you're going to be a vessel for this wisdom, because this is just really important. And just thinking back to my conversation with the director, the president of the World Food Bank, it is just so important to know, like, what is the worst thing that can happen. I just think that's really valuable information so that you're kind of protected, because you can really build you can build in life, but if you don't know, well, what could sink my marriage? What could destroy my finances? What's the worst that could happen with the tax situation in my business? I just think that that's important information. A lot of people don't want to know. They don't want to know, well, what's the worst that could happen if this area destabilizes? Like, a lot of people don't want to know, well, what's the worst things that could happen with essential oil safety? But you're not that person. You're here and you're learning. And even though there's probably not very much material to make inspiring social media memes out of this information, you're here. So I appreciate that. So let's talk about some common assumptions about essential oils. First of all, natural and safe are just not synonymous. A lot of people think of something natural that means that it can't have a dramatic effect in the body, and that's just not the case. Essential oils have been cleared as food grade, many of them, and they have been established to be safe, but there are still a lot of adverse reaction reports. And while many of them are listed as having no outcome, which is jargon for they were non events, they were nothing to be concerned about, they are still something that can affect your birth practice if you are serving mothers in birth. And I think that while some of these reactions that we're going to talk about may not seem like they're that big of a deal in the birth context because it's such an important moment, it is important. The same way that if you were to have a reaction on any day, it would be like, well, that doesn't really matter. But if it's your wedding day and you have the same reaction, it's a really big deal. And if you're the practitioner who advised the oils that cause that, it's a big deal. So the most likely adverse reaction is a skin reaction. And as I've spent months and probably years at this point interviewing midwives, doulas, nurses about adverse reactions in labor, there were a few takeaway points. I'm actually re-recording this presentation because I have taken out the pictures. And if you would like to look at pictures of adverse reactions of essential oils online, or look at, yeah, allergic reactions, I would really recommend that you do that because that will give you context for kind of what's possible. One story I that I wanted to share with you was a mom in transition who poured, quote, a few drops of undiluted ginger onto her hands and deeply inhaled to control her nausea while going through transition. And a reaction broke out on her face where her cupped hands had touched her facial skin. She said that she had used ginger like that before and never had a problem, but the itchy red patch on her skin began to fester into tiny blisters, and she began to really get upset about the oil because of the impending birth and asked for a hot, damp towel to wipe her hands and face with. Her doula ended up applying a gentle soap to multiple towels and kind of wiping down her hands and face before applying a cream. The reaction did seem to respond to first aid measures, and her blisters oozed and crusted in a 24-hour period and were gone with no long-term effect. There was another story about, do I want to share this? Yes. There was another story about a mom who applied a blend of clary sage, lavender, Roman chamomile, lang lang, and a few other oils to her abdomen while in early labor. She began to feel a tingling sensation and decided to get into the bath to wash it off. She was also about to get in the bath anyways. She said she had already used this oil when she got it earlier that month with no problem. The warm water increased the oil's absorption, and the tingling began to turn to a wheel and flare reaction that kind of looks like an inflamed bee sting. So the mom really started to fixate on the development of her symptoms, which had really taken over her birth experience at this point. Everyone was researching how to remove the oil, what could be going on. The reaction didn't respond to any of the first aid protocols that were found online. The reaction spread over the next 2 days as raised inflamed areas that spread to the mother's inner arm crease and up her neck. At first, she had thought the symptoms were from the oil, but as the reaction spread to other areas where she hadn't applied the oil, it seemed out of proportion to the oil application, and she became unsure. Eventually, after her left eye began to swell shut, 8 hours after the use, and 2 hours before the birth, everyone agreed that she seemed to be having an allergic reaction. Tiny bumps, hives began to appear and become more pronounced. Despite doing all of this preparation to have a home birth, the mother actually went to the hospital concerned about her own reaction, and then similar red raised bumps on the newborn, which were deemed to be unrelated. But that story, I think, really is illustrates the fact that essential oils can significantly alter birth trajectories. Here you have a mom who was really trying and had done all this planning to have a home birth, and that's a lot of work and a lot of planning, and ended up having to transfer. Not having to transfer, but she did transfer because she was concerned about the essential oils. So let's talk about maybe what happened in these stories so that you can get a better sense of what are some possible risk factors. So here are some things that are known causes of vulnerability. It was kind of fun. I was able to talk to the a top formulator at doTERRA who had created the Forgive blend, which is just my favorite blend. And I had talked with another girl who was also an essential oil scientist who, and the kind of the three of us were dialoguing because this other essential oil scientist who was actually a top formulator for the kids line, she was telling me that she was becoming a doula and that her sister was about to give birth and that was going to be her first doula client. And she, wasn't its, a master's level essential oils formulator, scientist, safety expert. And so I was sharing this information with her, and she actually got out a notepad and started taking notes. She was like, yeah, I could really see how that would be the case. But from our kind of casual, I don't want to overstate this, but in our casual research, I guess you would say, with midwives, nurses, doulas, these are some things that we feel would really increase the vulnerability factors that are all affected by birth. So the common things that increase your risks for adverse skin reactions would be things like the total quantity of the essential oils, the concentration, the number of different oils that are blended. Oils like eucalyptus can really change the chemical constituent uptake of other essential oils. The carrier that you use, the frequency and duration of exposure, these are all things that can affect adverse reaction. And so essential oils that are diluted in a fixed oil, like a carrier oil, they're absorbed more slowly than undiluted essential oils, and the absorption timeline is also affected by the oil's composition, including the weight of the molecule and then different physiochemical properties such as its polarity, etc. But in birth, there's a whole bunch of other factors which I was sharing with these formulators that they really validated what we feel that we found because a lot of doulas and midwives will say, well, even moms that are experienced oil users seem to be having more adverse reactions in birth. Why is that the case? Well, it's because of things like The area of the body that the skin is applied to matters. So if the skin is really thin on the scalp but thick on the feet, that matters. How much is taken up, how much of the skin is covered, the temperature of the skin. So if the skin is really hot because the mom's body core temperature is really raised from a hard labor, that's going to affect the uptake of the oil. The condition of the skin. Does the mom have a compromised barrier function because of stretch marks? Skin that is stretched over her abdomen, that's going to affect how many chemical constituents are going transdermally into the skin. The age of the skin matters. The hormonal levels of the oil user matters. Women have greater risk of allergic reaction to essential oils than men. The reasons are probably hormonal. That's a quote from the Tisserand Institute. So we do know that the hormones play an effect in the uptake of the chemical constituent. People who have had different types of seasonal allergies, there's a correlation that means they're more prone to skin allergies. The reason for this link may be genetic or may be due to immune reacting cells migrating from one part of the body to another. We have an increase in the heat and humidity of most birth spaces, especially oil exposure through wet skin, is something that really increases adverse reactions. And then, oh, I already quoted this. Great, I have it on a slide. Women tend to have more allergic reactions to oils than men. And we also have a correlation between seasonal allergies and skin allergies. So, for all of these reasons, mothers may be more likely to have an oil reaction in birth, even if she is an experienced oil user. So, let's look at the types of adverse reactions in skin. Now, I read multiple inconsistent usages of these terms online with no real clear categories. People would just like throw out these words. And like I said, it wasn't until I read several textbooks that I had any idea what was going on. So I'm really glad to be presenting this information for you because it matters when we go into our first aid. Um, course, you're going to see why. So, the first type of adverse reaction that can happen is irritant contact dermatitis, which even in like a lot of papers, it would just say ICD. And, you're like, what does that mean? So, irritation from essential oils is less of a problem than a full allergic reaction. There's also less clinical data, but with contact dermatitis, essentially the skin just has a reaction from essential oil use that is proportional to the oil use. So, according to the Tisserand Institute, they would say this is the least problematic of skin reaction, and the inflammation dies down quickly after the oil is removed from the skin, even though it is unpleasant and undesirable. So these are signs and symptoms of irritant contact dermatitis. The skin turns slightly red, light colored skin, it looks like a bright red rash. On darker color skin, it just looks darker. There can be tingling, itching, burning. This can become rather severe. It can lead to cracked, scaly, or shiny skin. You can have little bumps or blisters, raised welts, sometimes oozing and crusting, and swelling and tenderness. This is caused by an oil dose that's inappropriate or an increased degree of absorption that initiates an inflammation response due to skin damage. So this is caused directly from oil dose or from an increased degree of absorption. This reaction does not include an immune response. It is not an allergic reaction. It is when before we started out with the three things that can cause reactions. So we said that the dose, the degree of absorption, and the degree of reaction are three reasons why you can have an adverse reaction. So with irritant contact dermatitis, it is never caused by a degree of reaction between the immune system. It is not an allergic response. And what that means is that you're not going to have this unless you really misuse the oils, unless you put too much of a dose and there are too many factors that are increasing the absorption of that oil. Does that make sense? So there's a few things that you need to know about irritant contact dermatitis. Um, I would say from my experience with doing interviews that the number one reason this happens is because of poorly diluted essential oils in a bath. So if you that's something to just be aware of. And a lot of things that people think are fine ways to use oils in bath, like they mix them into salts or they mix them with milk. Those are not sufficient mediums to add essential oils to bath water. If you haven't taken our essential oils safety course for water birth, that's for sure something that I would recommend. So this reaction, like I said, is not an immune response. It is not an allergic reaction. The skin irritation presents quickly. It intensifies, and then the reaction declines in a decrescendo pattern. So this is something that does respond to first aid measures and with proper information can be reasonably avoided. If you don't make a huge mistake with your dose or, then you're not going to have this problem. However, this is something, and this is most common. Now let's look at allergic contact dermatitis because this is an allergic response and it's also called a hypersensitivity reaction. And this is where like a lot of these terms were not used appropriately. And I think people, maybe you didn't fully understand them, wrote posts about this, and it just all got very convoluted. So let me just lay this out really clearly so you have clear understanding and increased confidence. So allergic contact dermatitis is not the same as irritant contact dermatitis. It is an allergic reaction. There are two categories to it, immediate or delayed. Both immediate and delayed hypersensitivity manifest as an inflammation response to oil constituents. So this is why you need to know about this, is because you can apply a conservative dose that is appropriate for birth, and you can control for factors that increase the absorption of the essential oil, like what you'll see in the handout and what I just ran through with you really quickly in this presentation. All of these things increase your chance of causing irritant contact dermatitis and allergic contact dermatitis. If the mom is older, if she has a lot of hormones in her system, if it's a hotter humid environment, if she has a history of allergic reaction, all of these things increase the chance of having a reaction. Um, so you can control for all of those things and you can do an appropriate dose, but this is the wild card is that you can have the right dose, you can control for all of these factors and the mom can still have a serious allergic reaction because of the reactions between the oils and the immune systems. These reactions are hard to predict. It is hard to control the mom's susceptibility to this, but there are some known vulnerable populations that you can discover before the birth, such as if the mom has a personal or family history of allergic reactions. So the EU has listed 26 fragrance chemicals as skin allergens, 16 of which occur in essential oils. So these really, the Tisserand Institute's interpretation of the clinical literature is that only some of these should be classified as allergens. Some only become allergic upon oxidation, so if the oil is oxidized. But really, this you can have an allergic reaction to several essential oils. So there are four types of allergic reactions that can manifest on the skin. Essential oil allergies are not IgE mediated reactions like food allergies or autoimmune diseases or newborn RH incompatibilities. Essential oils or other fragrant materials only can produce type 1 or type 4 allergic reactions. So these are the four classifications. This is information taken from the Tisserand Institute. So a lot of people will say, well, allergic reactions aren't possible with essential oils, and that's only partially true. Type 1 and type 4 allergic reactions can happen to essential oils. Type 2 and type 3 cannot. So this information is all found in your download sections of this training. So this is the difference between immediate and delayed reactions. So immediate allergic contact dermatitis is type 1. So here we're talking about type 1 allergic reactions. I know this is getting a little tedious and a little long, but stick with me, we're almost to the end. Immediate allergic contact dermatitis is a reaction where a serum antibody is produced and histamines are released from mast cells. So the blood flow to the affected site is increased, and the reaction can be either local or systemic. So this is something that happens particularly in people with a history of allergen. What this looks like is you can have shock, you can have a decrease in your blood pressure, you can have constricted airways, rapid weak pulse, skin rash, nausea, and vomiting. You can have a serious anaphylactic allergic reaction to a very conservative amount of essential oil. This is something that I care very deeply about because my special needs daughter almost died from an anaphylactic um, uh, allergic reaction to an unknown additive substance in a appropriate dose of children's cough medicine and ended up in the NICU for several days after almost dying in my older child's arms in the 6-minute drive to the emergency room. So if you've never seen someone almost die from an anaphylactic allergic reaction, it's actually quickly escalating, life-threatening. It can occur within seconds or minutes of exposure. You may have heard of these types of things with things like peanuts or bee stings. This causes the immune system to release chemicals that cause shock. The blood pressure drops, airways constricts, breathing is sometimes blocked. And so this is obviously, blood pressure dropped, weakened pulse is obviously not ideal for a laboring mother. Other common allergy symptoms would include things like red, watery eyes, runny nose, hives are possible, as well as asthma. So all of these things are things that can absolutely happen from a conservative dose of essential oils. Don't be afraid, just know that it can happen. Additional immediate responses include things like irritation and inflammation of the mucous membrane inside of the nose, inflammation of the bronchial tube lining. It can also cause a asthma attack, which is something my husband actually has, asthma-like attacks when lavender is diffused. So this, just something that you should know, about 25% of the population do have a family history of immediate allergy and are prone to get type 1 reactions. So this is absolutely something that you want to check in and ask before you apply oils that can cause allergic reactions. Things like Roman chamomile, lavender. There's multiple oils that are common in birth that can cause this. So the most common type of adverse reaction to essential oils is actually type 4, and this reaction is called delayed hypersensitivity. And this is something that is called what it is, delayed hypersensitivity, because it does not occur the first time the skin is exposed to the substance. This is where things get really interesting and weird and fun. Not really fun. So, a lot of times, what can happen is a mom can be like, I'm going to treat myself to a new oil in birth. This happens all the time with Roman chamomile. They've never purchased Roman chamomile because it's a more expensive oil. They treat themselves for their birth. They use it before the birth to just try it. A lot of times they'll open up the bottle, they'll put it on their hands, they'll put it up to their nose, they'll deeply inhale it, and they don't have any reaction to it. And they love it. They're like, wow, this is such a treat. And a lot of times if you've given birth, there's that rush to do things before the birth. Oftentimes there's like, oh, I've got to buy the essential oils. They'll come like a day or two before the birth. She uses it once before the birth. And what happens? So the essential oils combined with skin proteins, now they can sensitize T cells and circulate throughout the whole body, particularly the lymph nodes. They sensitize even more T cells, which is how the reaction then can spread from the primary contact site to distant parts of the body that are not even directly in contact with the oil allergen. And so the most important identifying symptom of delayed allergic contact dermatitis type 4 is that the reaction can spread from the primary contact site to distant parts of the body that are not in direct contact with the oil. So remember the mom in the beginning of the story who used an oil and had a little bit of a reaction at the initial site, but then her eye swelled shut. So that's how an allergic reaction spreads, and you can really start to get a reaction. So So we've already talked about allergic contact dermatitis, which is just an allergic reaction that can happen with an essential oil. There's immediate reactions and then there's delayed reactions. So there's two phases of delayed allergic contact dermatitis. And again, this is something where there was so much confusion and like misuse of terms online that it just started driving me insane. I just for the longest time thought, I have no idea what's going on because of how people misuse these words, but you will now have clarity, which I'm thankful for. So, type 4 allergic reaction has two phases, right? The mom buys the oil, she treats herself, she's sensitized. So, sensitization is a technical term for this type of reaction. Let's look at how it works. Sensitization occurs when the non-specific immune cells pick up this hapten carrier protein complex and it migrates to the lymph nodes and other parts of the body. This is when the T cells really start to enter the circulation, they enter the dermis, the sensitization process is complete, and the new T cells now are ready to respond to the antigen if they encounter it again. Okay, so the mom doesn't necessarily have um, an incredible response with the sensitization. She just experiences the oil, and this is what happens. She thinks this is why there's a lot of confusion then when she has a delayed allergic reaction because the mom thinks, well, I used this oil and I didn't have a problem. I've already used this oil once before. I got this and I used it earlier this week and I didn't have a reaction. She had a sensitization. So look out for that. The word sensitization is misunderstood and misused. It is often talked about in different articles that I found online, almost as if it was a distinct category of adverse reaction. It isn't. Sometimes they use it as like a synonym for allergic reaction. The second use of the words doesn't even make sense, but really, sensitization describes the priming of the immune system that subsequently leads to allergic reaction. So it's a part of the process. So really with this type of allergic reaction, you have exposure and then you have reaction upon re-exposure to the essential oil. So increasing use can lead to persistent and severe reactions. Usually the T cells mount an immune challenge which produces the allergic reaction, and this phase usually takes 24 to 48 hours. The first time the antigen is picked up following the sensitization, then you can have reactions that last for several hours, but can also last for days. So the first exposure, just to be totally clear, sensitizes the mother. Later exposures elicits the reaction. In sensitization, little or no um, evidence is shown that there is a problem with the substance, but then the inflammation reaction later to subsequent exposures to the same material causes a hypersensitivity to the allergen. It's also possible that the mom has a small reaction at the beginning. Like she could have you can have multiple. So she could have irritant contact dermatitis and that be the sensitizing event, etc. The reapplication of the same essential oil or blend will cause subsequent allergic reactions because the immune system has been primed. So in some people, allergens resolve after 10 or 20 years, but most people will have an allergic reaction to for life. So just to be clear, an irritant contact dermatitis and an immediate allergen contact dermatitis um, reaction can present very similarly. What are the differences? One essential oil may affect both at the same time, which we just said. Irritation can actually initiate the first stage of an allergic reaction, sensitization, because of the reduced barrier function. It facilitates the cells to initiate that immune reaction. So it's really difficult even for dermatologists to determine upon examination if an adverse reaction is an immediate allergic contact dermatitis type 1 reaction or if it's just a case of irritation contact dermatitis when they present similarly. Why does it matter that you know what the difference is? Well, it matters because of how you treat it. So with irritant contact dermatitis, there is an acute onset. There will never be, if you apply an oil and you don't have a reaction till 6 hours later, it's not irritant contact dermatitis. It's just not. with irritant contact dermatitis, there is always an acute onset with no time lapse between exposure and symptoms. Generally, I maybe overstated that a little, but if you're trying to discern what type it is, this is just a general rule. There are outliers. You're going to have acute onset. It's going to appear after the first exposure. You're going to know right away when you use the oil that there's going to be a problem. The rash is going to be limited to the area of contact. That's important. Okay? There's going to be a decrescendo phenomenon. It's going to be really bad at first. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. Then it's going to reach a rapid peak, and then it's going to start to resolve. Okay? The nature and extent of the reaction is going to depend on the dose of the essential oil. So if you like really made bad choices with volume and dilution and duration of exposure, I mean really bad choices. I mean like literally your conscience kicked in and you were hearing from Holy Spirit. Like you should like I've done things to myself where I knew my conscience was like you should not put that much lemon into that clay mask, and then I went into the sun and got a phototoxic. I didn't like, I thought I was in the shade, but I ended up breaking out in like horrible scabs all over my face that like scabbed from like the lower layer of my skin. It took like months to clear up. Like if you're going to cause an irritant contact dermatitis situation, you're probably going to use such a ridiculous dose that like your conscience said something to you. So this is something where it's kind of like, can you cause this? Yes. And have I? Yes, multiple times. I have used oils inappropriately, like what I just shared, and suffered the consequences. But it's something that you're going to be like, okay, like I caused this, and you're going to kind of, you're going to kind of know. The redness inflammation is going to present. You're going to have burning and stinging. But the good news is that this type of reaction is going to respond to first aid measures. Okay. Allergic contact dermatitis is going to be different. So this is how you know that it's not the first one. The first is that acute or delayed onset is possible. So the first thing that should be triggering in your mind if a mom says, well, I applied an oil and I woke up the next day with, or she talks about a delayed response, then you know. It can also be acute. So my husband has had an allergic reaction to lavender where it's like the diffuser goes on, he immediately has a headache, he immediately can't breathe, he immediately feels like he needs to lay down. Okay. So the sensitization is always necessary before the reaction occurs. So if a mom is having a reaction and it's the first time she's used that oil, it may not be um, an allergic contact dermatitis situation. The inflammation may spread. So with allergic contact dermatitis, just to be clear, the acute symptoms happen always after the sensitization, if that makes sense. So it's going to be acute on the second time. Sensitization is necessary before the reaction occurs. And I think sensitization takes 24 to 48 hours. I'm not totally clear on that. Like, I don't know if you use an essential oil, if you can be sensitized and then you use it a very short period of time later, if those would be perceived as the body as two distinct events. But if you're interested in that, look into it more. Inflammation spreads to the different parts of the body other than the area of contact. So if the mom starts having difficulty breathing, or her eyes swell shut when she doesn't think she got essential oils there, or she starts having pretty much, if the oil reaction spreads to an area of the body that wasn't exposed to essential oils, it's easy to think, well, I don't know, it was on my hands. Like, did I touch that part? But this is a major sign that this is actually an allergic reaction. Another sign is that you're going to have a crescendo phenomenon. It's going to be amazing how bad it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And there have been birth stories where you're like listening and you're like, oh, and it just keeps getting worse. And you're like, no, it's going to get worse. The next point is that the nature and extent of the reaction is going to seem totally disproportionate to the dose of essential oil. So with irritant contact dermatitis, as you're doing it, there's probably going to be a little voice that's going to be like, this is too much. With allergic contact dermatitis, you can use a dose where you're like, where you check in with yourself and you're like, did I use this inappropriately? And you're going to be like, no, this wasn't an inappropriate dose. And so it actually is an allergic reaction, just similarly to, um, a kid can eat a very small amount of peanuts, or you can have a very small amount of bee sting venom, and the reaction just seems so disproportionate to the dose. Irritated, itchy, shiny skin is common. Tiny blisters and welts are common. Oozing lesions. And most importantly, the thing for you to know is that allergic contact dermatitis may not respond to first aid measures because the immune system has been activated. And so topical first aid measures aren't going to address that. Does that make sense? Which leads us to our first aid masterclass. So, the information on how to address these phenomenons is in our next class on first aid for essential oils. And so that concludes our presentation on adverse reactions for essential oils. Everything that I said, that was just fire hosing you guys with kind of the what and the how and the why. All of this information is in a PDF download so that you can review this information, become familiar with it, and be able to explain this confidently to people that you're serving in birth or for yourself. So I hope you really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you in the next course. Bye.